I just want to pick up that thread about looking at some of the data and the evidence and thinking about what it means for South Australia. I wanted to spend a little bit of time just digging into the PISA 2012 data, because this is about the mathematics, and again this is about our 15-year-olds, and so we could look at it in that kind of data-driven way and say, oh, this tells us about our 15-year-olds. But what I want you to think about as I'm showing some of the data with you is what that might mean for our partnerships from preschool all the way through school and to the point where we look at our 15-year-olds and capture some data about them. In 2012, the focus was on mathematics in PISA, this international comparison. And of course, so it meant that we've got data to compare Australia to the world, but we've also got data to compare South Australia to the world and to other states and territories. And it's that comparison that I wanted to bring out. So I'm going to talk about some of the data. What's interesting about the PISA 2012 was chapter 1, essentially, or the first couple of chapters were about performance. So the first few chapters are about performance in maths and reading and science. And you've got to make it all the way in this 300+ page document. You've got to make it all the way to chapter 7 before you start to see some things beyond the results. And when you look at those things beyond the results, I think you start to see some really startling things. So in PISA, what they do is they'll look at things like, so they'll describe it as, so students' intrinsic motivation to learn mathematics, which they define as enjoyment. So these are all PISA definitions. You've got to be careful with the PISA definitions because you've got to apply all around the world. But of course, they'll interpret them in slightly different ways around the world. The way in which they get an index, a number, around students', in this case, intrinsic motivation to learn mathematics is, they look at the proportion of students that agree with a chunk of statements. And so to determine students' intrinsic motivation to learn mathematics, they ask students to what extent they agreed with these 4 statements about enjoying reading maths, looking forward to the maths lessons, doing maths because they enjoy it, and being interested in the things that they learn in mathematics. I'm going to show you some data sets that look like this, and in all of them, where there's a star, an asterisk, South Australian students responded least well to that statement, so in this case agreed less with that statement than any other state or territory in Australia. Where there is a dagger symbol, this symbol, where there's a dagger symbol, South Australian students responded less well than Indigenous students across the country. So if you look at the intrinsic motivation to learn mathematics, what we see is that our students didn't agree with these statements to the extent that other states and territories did, and in fact didn't agree with these statements to the extent that Indigenous kids did across the country. So what we see is South Australia is the lowest, and we also found that there were 2 groups that were actually below the OECD average in Australia. And those 2 groups that were below the OECD average were female students nationally and South Australian students. In fact, Northern Territory and in rural Australia, so not limited to South Australia, but rural Australia, those students were in fact amongst the highest groups, highest proportion of students in those groups agreed with these statements. And as I said, South Australia, when you look at the overall, South Australia's kind of index on this was lower than the National Indigenous Index. So straight away, what we started to see in this data, I think, is some challenges around our students' intrinsic motivation, our students' enjoyment of maths. We can definitely argue with these statements as being useful statements. We can argue with a whole host of things about, well, what does that actually mean? What would our students be thinking? I would be with you entirely on thinking about that. I also don't want to drill too far down, though I will take that risk on a couple of points later on, into the individual responses. But the thing that I think is interesting is when we compare it to other states and territories. And this is a really important thing to think about, I think, when we're thinking about our data and our evidence. We've always got to ask ourselves a question, compared to what? You get this data, and Does it look good? Does it look bad against our story? Well, I don't know if I don't have it compared to what. I've always got to compare it to something. And so I'm trying to give you a group of comparisons here to of course, challenge some of our thinking. If we look at that instrumental motivation, and so what we're seeing there is about, that link to work and careers and to what you might be doing after school. So making an effort in maths is worth it because it will help me to do the work that I want later on. Learning maths is worthwhile for me because it will improve my career prospects and chances. Lowest level of agreement from all the states and territories. Maths is important for me. Maths is an important subject for me for what I want to study later on. So 15-year-olds, for what I want to study later on. Lowest state of other state and territories and lower than Indigenous students across the country. I will learn things in maths that will help me get a job. Lower than Indigenous students across the country. So again, some real challenges in there in terms of South Australia being having the lowest level of instrumental motivation as measured by PISA. And it's difficult to make some arguments about our kind of rurality or about our SES or our industry or something like that, because actually Tasmania and the Northern Territory had the highest index in these, and rural kids were the highest. In fact, Indigenous and female students but the responses were very low on this. And so it's even more challenging where South Australians doing poorly compared to Indigenous students generally. We're about to do some work trying to cut this data a bit smaller, because if there's some real challenges here for female students and some challenges for South Australia, what does it look like for South Australian female students? Where we see challenges for Indigenous students across the country and challenges for South Australian students, what does it look like for Indigenous South Australian students? What does it look like for female Indigenous South Australian students? I haven't got that data, I haven't got that evidence to share with you, but those questions are really large in my mind about the way in which the education system is interacting with those students and how it's shaping those students beyond their results, and of course potentially having an impact on their results. Students' self-concept in maths, and I'm not going to read them all out again. You can have a read of those sorts of responses that we get to students. Now this one was particularly interesting though. Tasmania, the ACT really stand out, as students there really stand out as having this positive self-concept in maths, agreeing with these statements. Again, what we find is South Australia is at the bottom in terms of the comparison to other states and territories. But a funny thing happened, because while our performance is lower than other states, is low compared to most of the other states and territories, and our general disposition, that general kind of motivation in maths was low, what we found was it wasn't really reflected so strongly in our students' self-concept, because we're low on some of them, but on things like I get good grades in maths, our students actually came out really well. Lots of our students said, I get good grades in maths. And that's not true. They don't get good grades in maths. So what's going on? And so I've got the data, that's the data. How do I turn that data into evidence? Well, really, that's about our interpretation. That's about my interpretation, your interpretation, how you would interpret that. And of course, the challenge that I've got is, well, one of the things I think is one plausible explanation for this is that it's the compared to what? I get good grades in maths compared to the kids around me. That level of challenge, that level of expectation that our kids have got in terms of their performance in maths, I think that data might be telling us something about that. There are other ways of interpreting that. And so, of course, what I'm trying to do is make the distinction between the data and how that turns into evidence through our interpretation of it, and how that might get us to ask some more questions about tracking our kids and thinking about our kids. And then that asks some questions about how, of course, we would respond to it. So what does this mean for our story? If I hold on to those ideas of achievement, engagement, equity, and challenge, when we think about how we analyse and interpret this data, as I said, this perception of getting good grades, we're above New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia. way higher proportion of South Australians answer this question, respond positively to this, agree with this than you would expect. And of course, as I said, it might come back to this idea of challenge and the nature of challenge. The kids think they're doing well compared to what, against what kinds of challenge? Are we challenging them? Are we stretching them? What are their expectations? What are our expectations of them? This isn't data, but it might be evidence. It might be the sorts of questions that we're asking. I'm going to keep going with this because I want to think about how we're drilling down into our data, how we're looking at it, and we're slowing down and looking at it and thinking about it. It's really easy to get these bunch of numbers, the data, and just cast your eye over it and go, oh yeah, whatever. Oh yeah, high, low, pretty good. If you look at this, what they did around the world was they asked students they didn't ask them to do these questions. What they asked them was, how confident would you feel, confident or very confident? How confident would you feel in doing this question? So the whole bunch of questions, things like using a train timetables, how to work out how long it would take to get from one place to the other. What I've shown you here is the proportion of South Australian students who felt confident with that question and the proportion of and the range of the other states and territories. So as you can see, we're just in touch here with the other states and territories. And so we can see, calculating how much a TV would be after a discount and so on, whole host of responses. And you look at that and go, you could look at that from a kind of data point of view and respond to it in a data point of view and say, oh, look at this one. Look at this one here. Calculating the petrol consumption rate of a car. How confident would you feel? South Australians really fall outside of the range of the other states and territories. So if you look at it from a data point of view, the naive response would be, teach them that. Tell them how to do that. And then when PISA comes around next time, they'll be able to do that. And of course, we know that doesn't work. And so, but what would be our strategic response? How would we use the data and turn it into evidence? Well, the first thing to note is, yes, South Australia is the lowest, again, down there with the Northern Territory. And in fact, South Australia, Northern Territory and Tasmanian students were all below the OECD average. So all those countries I showed you before, in terms of our confidence levels in responding to, addressing these questions, our students got very low levels of confidence. Our Indigenous and female students are the same across the country. But what's interesting if you step back and look for the evidence in it, instead of looking for the data in it, is that there's some questions where we really fall in the middle of the range. And those questions are all the questions where it says, do this, solve this equation. You can do that, great, I know how to do that. Solve an equation like this, quite a complex equation to solve. Our students were really confident in doing that. Doing stuff we were good with. But then when you look at it in a different way, and you look at the ones where we fall outside of the range, that's about understanding graphs presented in a newspaper. That one, you could see how that could be a just do this, but you could also see how it could be a little bit of a problem-solving question. And then calculating the petrol consumption rate of a car, construct the problem, construct the way that you would go about this for yourself. Not just do this, but construct the way you would go about doing this for yourself. That's where South Australians really start to fall outside of that range. And so again, it's data, but if you think about it in different ways, if you step back and think about the big picture around it, what you can see is something really challenging for us, I think. And again, you could look at it and say, oh, this is just 15-year-olds. It's got nothing to do with me in primary school. That's got nothing to do with me in preschool sites. But if you step back and look at the bigger picture and think about how we're developing students' disposition in mathematics, or in any learning area, but if we look at students' disposition in mathematics, how we have a strategic approach to developing that from preschool through to senior secondary, I think that's when, again, the data doesn't tell us anything about that. It tells us almost nothing about that. It was a snapshot of 15-year-olds. But the way that we choose to interpret it tells us about our story and how we might respond to it.